Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to be having a look at one of the more eccentric chapters of the God Emperor's Adeptus Astartes. A chapter that truly owns and embodies the old epithet, Angels of Death, the Mortifactors. This chapter, grim even by the standards of the God Emperor's avenging angels, hail from an unlikely sire, considering their combat doctrine and their somewhat relaxed approach to the Codex Astartes. Their gene father, you see, was Roboute Guilliman, the author of that self-same famous tome. And the Mortifactors' deviation from the standard Ultramarines template is even more noteworthy due to them being a second founding chapter, the process through which the Loyalist legions were split into smaller organizations of 1,000 battle brothers, a mere 7 years after the conclusion of the Great Heresy. In those dark times, the Imperium still stood perched at the precipice of annihilation and had just barely started the long and hard journey to right itself. The Mortifactors were in these gloomy days blessed with the visionary leadership of Captain Sasebo Tezuka, a name hinting at an origin in the far east of Terra's ancient past, and as we know from such characters as Yagu Nagasina and Adept Hiroku, those were a spiritual people. This may go some way to explain, then, the actions of Tezuka as he placed his freshly forged chapter in the hands of faith, or more specifically, on the cards of the Imperial Tarot. And bear you in mind the era in which this was done as well. This was extraordinarily unusual back then. The God Emperor was still not widely viewed as a god, and even more rarely so by the sons of the Primarchs. Faithful individuals were, of course, not entirely unknown. The famous Sigismund spring to mind immediately, but nevertheless he and Tezuka were exceptions. Very rare ones as well. Furthermore, the usage of the tarot was another curiosity, considering its ties to a now reviled traitor. Nevertheless, the cards did not lead Tezuka and his chapter astray, though at first I must imagine that to many of the fresh battle brothers of the Mortifactors, in their recently repainted armor as they stood by the viewing ports of their ships, it really must have seemed so, because the planet that the tarot led them to was seemingly completely and utterly dead. The world was shrouded in eternal darkness, and only after lengthy searching through Imperial archives was the name finally dragged from the depths. The Mortifactors' new homeworld was called Posul. And fortunately for the Mortifactors, it was, in fact, not completely dead. Savage tribes of tech barbarians still prowled its surface, though for all true intents and purposes, it was essentially a death world, although technically qualified merely as a night world, due to the never-ending, never-breaking layer of thick smog and pollutants in the upper atmosphere, strangling any over-ambitious rays of light that had struggled all the way from the system's distant sun over to Posul. I have no doubt that you're not going to have any problems imagining that the combination of lack of direct sunlight and vast distances to the local star leading to a frigid climate meant that staying alive on this blighted little hellhole was a very challenging undertaking. And indeed, the only way they could even possibly begin to hope to stay alive would be if they still retained some level of technology. I mean, No sun, that in and of itself will lead to unfortunate consequences for the human physiology. When you add then in the permanent frost and the inability to grow anything on the surface of the planet, yeah, unless they've got access to some fairly advanced underground tech, including hydroponics, medicine, heating, electricity, etc., yeah, there wouldn't be a whole lot of people alive on this planet. And indeed, there weren't a whole lot of people alive, but there were some, presumably living within hardened shelters, either on the surface or subterranean. Which in turn, of course, also means that there are very few areas on the planet that could be considered actually livable. What do you think happens when the great unwashed hordes of humanity find themselves squeezed into an ever smaller area whilst competing for ever-dwindling resources? Well, what you get as it happens is the ideal training ground for Space Marine neophytes. See? Never a cloud so dark as to not allow for a little silver lining, eh? Yes, I mean, living on this world would be exceptionally arse, even by the imaginative standards of the Imperium of Man, which, let us all be honest, has turned cruel, unusual, brutal, and horrendous living standards into a de facto art form. But, again, at least the Space Marines have a good place to recruit their soldiers from. And in that regard, Tezuka's reading of the Imperial Turret had landed him spot on. Because for all of its defects and drawbacks for the general populace, Posul was an extraordinary recruitment ground for the Adeptus Astartes. Right there in that perfect little sweet spot, where the planet provided enough in the way of population to have a large, stable gene pool and plentiful recruits, but was also hostile enough, both from a natural standpoint as to breed natural-born survivors, and also from an aggressive standpoint, with the various tribes, organizations, gangs, etc., constantly at one another's throat, ensuring that the ways of war, killing, and brutality was taught to even the youngest of its children. And just like the Mortifactors would place their mark upon Posul with a massive space-borne void fortress in permanent orbit above the planet, the world would in turn leave its own mark on the Space Marines. We already know that Sasebo Tezuka was a spiritual person, probably well ahead of his time as far as matters of a certain deity on a golden throne were concerned, and in all due likelihood much of his chapter already shared many of his convictions. Simultaneously, the world Posul was, well, to quote that old James Morrow saying, there are no atheists in a foxhole. And whilst we may certainly debate the truism of that old saying, one must still admit that on a world like Posul, it would be rather difficult to not believe in some higher or lower power. We humans do have a tendency to attribute things beyond our own control, after all, to one of the two. And on a night-covered death world like Posul, there are an awful lot of things that are well beyond the control of the average man. And with the life of the average citizen being filled with sudden, unexplainable and unexpected death, deprivation, starvation, and all manners of ills, it did not produce a sort of fluffy god. It did not produce a god of forgiveness, of glory or acceptance. It produced a warrior culture that outright worshipped death in its many forms. Presumably, perhaps, thinking that if they could simply placate the Reaper for long enough with actions that pleased him, they would be spared the attention of his eternal scythe. And in a way, they were correct. As with so many early, burgeoning religions, it formed around the teaching of simple lessons, a way to survive and thrive, and as the teachings proved valuable, they spread and took on a mythical aspect unavoidable in crude civilizations. It is simply much easier to tell a young boy to avoid the well because there is a monster inside of it than it is to explain to him in great detail the myriad reasons why a well might be dangerous and how he might not be found should he fall in. It's quite difficult to adequately explain ideas of death and danger to a young child, but a monster? Well, that hardly requires any explanation at all. Of course, lessons about avoiding wells were not quite as high in demand on a planet like Posul, where an altogether more combative doctrine was required. Fighting for survival was not a question of if, but when, and to thrive one had to be ruthless. One had to be the one taking, rather than the one taken from. And, as always, of course, there is strength in numbers, and so communities formed, led by witches, by shamans, by spiritual leaders and priests. The idea of ancestor worship probably became prevalent soon after, as a way for the elders to gain respect and prevent themselves from simply being exiled once their usefulness was at an end, and also as a way to add yet further gravity to their lessons. This crude religion was then further formed, evolved, and changed by the appearance of aforementioned priestly classes, shamans, mages, rituals, and all manners of grand spectacles to gain followings and spread the gospel yet further. And, of course, the angels. Imagine for a moment what a space marine would look like to primitive man. There is simply no way such a being wouldn't become an object of worship. And so the Mortifactors shaped the people, and through recruitment the people formed the Mortifactors in turn. Indeed, once the tradition of chapter chaplains became prevalent once more, they became the primary recruiters. They were dispatched down to the night world, and they would stalk the tunnels, looking for exceptional young individuals to bring back up into orbit and the fortress monastery, where they would be put to repeated and grueling trials to see if they had what it took to become one of the Emperor's chosens. And considering their vocation, it would not surprise me at all if they also spent a little bit of time teaching the locals themselves, too. This eventually led to the formation of a stable religion, with a single central deity, the ultimate warrior, a golden war god that sat upon a throne, lording over a massive, bright and beautiful feast hall far beyond the darkened skies. And those who proved worthy would travel to his side after death and eat and drink and fight alongside him for the rest of eternity. Sounds familiar, does it not? This variant upon the worship of the God Emperor also became the one officially practiced by the Mortifactors chapter. They became space marines who worshipped death, revered it, and honored it in a myriad of different ways. The most obvious being found on their space-born fortress monastery, the Basilica Mortis. As with all chapter fortress monasteries, it is first and foremost a military base of operation for the Mortifactors and their thralls. A hugely heavily armed and armored battle station, with the installations required to service the Mortifactors' fleet of strike cruisers, destroyers, and battle barges. It also features countless armories, manufactorum complexes, temples, and obviously living areas for the 1,000 plus Battle Brothers and their serfs. But so far so standard, right? Well, it is with the interior decor that things start to deviate quite drastically. You see, the variant of the imperial faith practiced by the Mortifactors, as mentioned, venerates death and, thusly, obviously, the dead themselves. The halls of their fortress monastery is lined with little alcoves containing the bones of the dead, presumably favored serfs and servants. There is also a vast hall where all the honored dead of the Mortifactors themselves sit as if at a banquet table, having finally been laid to rest and their spirits sent off to join the ultimate warrior on Terra. There is a further room as well that has on occasion gotten the Mortifactors into a little bit of trouble with the Inquisition. A vast monolithic chapel, lined, built, and filled with the skulls of the Mortifactors' enemies. Yes. Certain members of the Ordo Hereticus has cast more than one dubious glance in the direction of the Mortifactors' habit of flensing the flesh of the skulls of their defeated foes and bringing them back home as trophies. Still, the Inquisition understands that warriors will be warriors. They will take trophies. And amongst the God Emperor's loyal subjects, there are plenty of those who take far grislier trophies than a mere flensed skull. And let's be honest here, the Imperium is hardly a stranger to the death's head aesthetic either. And if it was just that, I'm sure nothing more would ever have come of it, but that is not the only a peculiar tradition cherished by the Mortifactors. On the eve of battle, each brother secludes himself in his private chamber and enters into a ritualistic trance state, which has been described as death-like. In this state, they claim the ability to commune with their ancestors and the Primarch. I wonder what Reboot Gilliman would say, being visited in his dreams by one of these lads, but that's a different subject. After having completed their meditation, the Mortifactors deploy like all Astartes do, supremely confident of their own ability and assured of a crushing victory. Once it has been achieved, they then gather once more for a feast, where they drink copious quantities of the enemy's blood and engage in ritualistic cannibalism. Or, well, only occasional ritualistic cannibalism. The point is, they devour the flesh of their defeated enemies, which of course, that might not necessarily always be other humans, so again, only occasional cannibalism. Nevertheless, however, I think you can begin to see why the single raised eyebrow of the Ordo Malus Inquisitor has reached brand new heights and is threatening stable orbit around the dude's head at this point. Then you throw in the whole Chapel of Skulls, the worship of death, the chapter's preferred aesthetic of black and bone-white armor, decorated, of course, with yet further skulls and bones, and as a finishing touch, right on top of it all, power scythes. Yes, one of the Mortifactors' signature weaponry is the very self-same weapon wielded almost exclusively by the forces of chaos, foremost amongst them, of course, the Death Guard and their Primarch Mortarion. That is a very unfortunate set of coincidental circumstances that make for very inquisitive inquisitors indeed. And the Mortifactors have had to bear with more than their fair share of surprise inspections and inquisitorial guests, just there to observe, of course. But the Mortifactors remain a loyal Space Marine chapters, and for all of their eccentric traditions, no Inquisitor has yet found the brass balls required to take the matter any further. And in the Mortifactors' defense, their worship of death is not indiscriminate. They do not worship everyone who died everywhere. Their worship is far more specific than that. It is, in many ways, a form of extended ancestral worship, you could perhaps say. They worship Imperial saints universally. They worship their fallen battle brothers. They worship the Primarchs of other legions. They worship the Emperor, of course, foremost amongst them in his, well, deathly state. And this has gone a long way to reassuring the Inquisition that the Mortifactors, despite some of their peculiarities, really are one of the good chapters. Another more specific incident as well that helped put a lot of the Inquisition's suspicions at ease was that the Mortifactors themselves made it inadvertently very clear that their practices did not venerate the idea of cannibalism or the devouring of one's enemies merely for the sake of it. It is important to remember that Space Marines possess a special organ that actually allows them to gain a measure of understanding of a foe by devouring their flesh. Even in certain circumstances, the ability to understand some of their thoughts, their motives, and perhaps even their ways of fighting. This is, of course, an obvious advantage, albeit a, pun intended, tasteless one in the eyes of the wider Imperium. It is, of course, one matter to know a thing, however, and another entirely to believe it. There was no guarantee that the Mortifactors were not indulging in their habits for some darker purpose, but they demonstrated that it was, in fact, for a pure purpose, as pure as eating one's defeated foes could ever be, I suppose. During several campaigns in the Jericho Reach, where the Mortifactors encountered the Kroot. Yes, those of you who have watched my lore video on the Kroot will know that they share a habit with the Mortifactors. The Kroot also ritualistically devour the enemies slain. Choice pieces of meat are picked out by their shapers and given out to the rest of their extended families. They are then able to absorb the victim's DNA and learn important tricks, and even take on beneficial traits from their slain foes. This is why the Kroots have evolved into such consummate killers, and why they've also evolved side paths like Kroot Hounds or the Great Narloks. One might at first glance figure that the Mortifactors and the Kroot would be the best of friends, exchanging less than entirely savory cooking recipes with one another over the roast corpse of a common foe. But that was not what happened at all, and be you absolutely certain that the Inquisition was looking very closely at the engagement to see if it would happen. Instead, once the Mortifactors learned of the Kroot's penchants for devouring the enemy's dead, they were absolutely aghast, horrified. This was not what they were doing. They did this in honor of their dead. They did this as a wholesome ritual, as a form of worship of the Emperor, as a means of growing stronger as his defenders, whereas here were monstrous, vile alien species taking into themselves the holy gene seed of the Mortifactors, of good Imperial citizens, and stealing their traits. Oh, no, no, no. The Mortifactors would have none of that at all, and engaged in truly vicious warfare, even by their standards, against the Kroot. And for all the problems that led to for the poor Tower mercenaries, the Inquisition on their side let out a sigh of relief. It turns out that yes, the Mortifactors really are one of the good guys. And that's a handy thing too, because they have proven themselves to be quite effective on the field of war, albeit a hint reckless. It should, after all, not come as much of a surprise to learn that the people who worship and venerate death aren't necessarily overly afraid of death, or injury for that matter, and they tend to be very, very aggressive. The Mortifactors recruit from amongst the warrior people, and they feel confident that in the heat of close-quarters combat, they'll be more than a match for anything the galaxy can throw at them. And on that note as well, when I was talking about how the Mortifactors come from an unexpected sire, I was not merely talking about their religious practices or their ritualistic foibles, but instead the fact that despite being an Ultramarines founding chapter, they're not actually all that fond of Guilliman's big blue book. Oh, they respect it, of course. They admire Guilliman as much as any other Ultramarines founding chapter, and they recognize that it has a great deal of wisdom to share with them and all the other chapters. But they do not revere it as the piece of absolute knowledge that many Ultramarines founding chapters, and even what remain of the One's Legion, do. They do instead view it as a source of inspiration, rather than a hard and fixed set of rules to live by, to train by, to fight by, and to worship by. They'll follow its teachings and doctrines when it seems relevant and logical and reasonable to do so, but otherwise they will follow their own path. Incidentally, of course, this was exactly what Guilliman wanted when he created the thing, for it to be a source of guidance rather than a literal Bible. Perhaps the Mortifactors do not hail from such an unlikely liege after all, in all due reality. Though, there is one rule that the Mortifactors play fast and loose with that Guilliman may not approve of, or considering his plan with the Primaris Marines, perhaps he'd approve of that one just as much. Namely, you see, the chapter's reliance upon the Imperial Turret, and more specifically, what its predictions made them do. As you probably already gathered from the fact that the chapter literally chose its home world based upon the predictions of playing cards, they take that kind of fortune-telling very, very seriously indeed. And so, when the turret suggested that the fate of the human race and all things in the galaxy would rest upon the world of Armageddon, when reports came in that it was about to be invaded by a beastly orc, the Mortifactors mobilized in a way never before seen in their chapter's history. Every last citizen on Posul that would become a Mortifactor was allowed into their ranks, and whilst that does not necessarily outright mean that they violated the Thousand Battle Brothers rules, it sure as all hells implies it. Even though, of course, many of the unsuitable candidates would suffer from gene seed rejection and simply die, and the Mortifactors would also have a finite supply of the valuable gene seed itself, that still would probably mean that as a chapter, they, at least for the Armageddon conflict, swelled well beyond the 1,000 limit stipulated in the Codex Astartes. Luckily, there were no over-eager, fresh-faced inquisitors nearby, with a wish to make a name for themselves, And so the Mortifactors' temporary creative interpretation of the Codex was never reported to anyone. Lucky that. Frankly, the Imperium has more than enough enemies as it is, without going out of its way to find fresh one from amongst the ranks of loyalists. And I'm completely certain that the good people of Armageddon as well were most pleased with the full attention of an entire chapter of Space Marines, 10 companies of Mortifactors, and an unusually large scout corps, I imagine. Must have been very welcome reinforcements. They also served with distinguishment throughout the Armageddon War and in many, many other conflict zones as well. Armageddon did not turn out, of course, to be the end of the world, but as far as the Mortifactors are concerned, that simply just means that there is another war that will eventually fulfill their prophecy. Classical, is it not? And interestingly as well, the war that so far has gotten closest to ending the world, at least as far as the Mortifactors are concerned, was not Armageddon or Orcs or anything like it, but in fact the Eldar, who rather sneakily opened up a webway portal right inside of the Mortifactors' fortress monastery. Having its home base invaded is a serious matter for any chapter, obviously, and considering the Basilica Mortis' position right above their recruitment world, the Mortifactors were put suddenly in a position where they might lose both at the same time. It was one of the single most dangerous incidents in the chapter's history. But the Mortifactors are no strangers to danger. On 2 separate incidents as well, they came very close to jeopardizing their existence as a chapter. The first, seemingly innocuous, but perhaps the most dangerous of all, happened in 819 of Millennia 41, where the Mortifactors believed themselves to have been insulted by the Crimson Fists, very nearly sparking a hot war between the 2 chapters. Now, the occasional skirmish between the Adeptus Astartes is a rarity but not unheard of. However, for a chapter like the Mortifactors, that might have led to the flensing of Crimson Fist skulls and the devouring of Space Marine flesh. As I've mentioned on several occasions, the Inquisition is already a little bit wary of the Mortifactors, and such an incident may have pushed them over the edge quite quickly. Luckily, that incident was halted by Manus Calgar before it could grow into something more permanent. In general, however, the Mortifactors simply just do not play well with others. They are a very religious chapter with their own, as we have multiple times mentioned now, unique beliefs that may not be as tolerated by others as they may have wished. Additionally, they are also extraordinarily superstitious. They see signs and omens in near everything. This led to another chapter, the Lamenters, almost being destroyed at one point, since the Mortifactors simply just outright refused to aid them, citing the Lamenters' ill fortune as a bad omen. The second incident that almost did the Mortifactors in was when the Tyranids came knocking to their recruiting world of Posul. Like they had done with so many planets before, the Tyranids invaded and left behind nothing more than a blasted, scarred wasteland. They had stripped the surface of the planet of virtually anything and everything that could be stripped. And considering the nature of the planet, I imagine it was sparse eating, but nevertheless, the planet's surface had been completely scoured. Fortunately, in all due likelihood, a great deal of Posul's population existed beneath the surface, and I've yet to hear of the Mortifactors claiming another homeworld, so chances are there are still population centers located deep beneath in tunnels and subterranean holds. The Mortifactors had survived the Tyranids, the Elder, and even, on one occasion, their brother's lack of understanding of their ways. And hopefully, they'll keep kicking for a long time yet. Though I imagine, once more, they may have difficulties adopting to Gilliman's new Imperium. Only time will tell. For now, I will wrap up this lore video on the Mortifactors chapter. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. If you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and a comment and all that, and sharing it around. Have a good day.